What happens when privilege collides with justice? Watch as an arrogant socialite faces a no-nonsense judge and learns a life lesson she'll never forget. The courtroom was packed that morning, buzzing with quiet murmurs as people shuffled into their seats. It was a typical day at the Los Angeles County Courthouse, except for one detail. This hearing was expected to draw attention. Tiffany Halstead, a socialite with a reputation for reckless behavior and an inflated sense of self, was due to stand before Judge William Grant. Known for his unshakable demeanor and sharp intellect, Judge Grant was respected throughout the legal community as a fair but no-nonsense arbiter of justice. Tiffany arrived in her usual fashion, late and unapologetic. Draped in designer labels and oversized sunglasses, she sauntered into the room as though it were a red carpet event. Her lawyer, visibly uncomfortable, walked quickly behind her, attempting to minimize the scene. The courtroom, used to decorum, fell silent as eyes shifted toward her. She stopped in the middle of the aisle, seemingly oblivious to the people waiting for her to take a seat. With a dismissive wave, she motioned for her lawyer to move aside so she could set her bag down on the bench. Her entitlement radiated as she removed her sunglasses with exaggerated flair, glancing around as though this were all beneath her. Judge Grant entered moments later, the air in the room changing instantly. The murmurs died down, replaced by a respectful hush. In his mid-50s, Grant was an imposing figure with his tall frame and calm authority. His sharp eyes scanned the room briefly before settling into his chair. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Tiffany hesitated, clearly irritated, before standing with a heavy sigh. Her expression screamed, "Why am I even here?" Judge Grant didn't react. He adjusted his glasses, opened the file before him, and began the proceedings. Tiffany's case was a fairly straightforward one, a series of parking violations compounded by an incident of reckless driving that had endangered a pedestrian. But what could have been a routine hearing was about to take a dramatic turn, thanks to Tiffany's arrogance. As Judge Grant started outlining the charges, Tiffany's posture shifted. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and rolled her eyes, a blatant sign of disrespect that did not go unnoticed. But instead of addressing her behavior, Judge Grant carried on with calm professionalism. His tone was measured, his words deliberate. It was as though he was daring her to continue her act. The tension in the room began to build, and even the most seasoned court regulars sat up a little straighter, sensing something brewing. But Tiffany, oblivious to the storm she was inviting, had no intention of backing down. Tiffany shifted in her seat, her irritation becoming more pronounced with every word Judge Grant spoke. She began tapping her manicured nails against the wooden table, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgently, but Tiffany waved him off with a dismissive flick of her hand. The room, already tense, seemed to hold its breath. When Judge Grant asked her to confirm her identity, she barely glanced up. "Yeah, that's me," she said, her tone laced with indifference. A collective murmur rippled through the room. Judge Grant's expression remained calm, though his eyes lingered on Tiffany for a moment longer than usual. "Miss Halstead," he began, his voice steady. "In this courtroom, we adhere to a certain level of decorum. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." Tiffany smirked, as though the judge's words were some sort of joke. She leaned back in her chair, twirling a strand of her blonde hair between her fingers. "Sure thing, Your Honor," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Gasps echoed softly through the room. The court reporter paused briefly before continuing her transcription. Even Tiffany's lawyer buried his face in his hands, visibly mortified. Judge Grant, however, remained unflappable. "Miss Halstead," he said again, his voice firm but calm. "Do you understand the charges brought against you today?" Tiffany rolled her eyes again, this time audibly sighing. "Honestly, no. I mean, it's just some dumb parking tickets and—" "What? Someone getting scared because I hit the gas too hard? This is a waste of time." The courtroom fell silent. All eyes were now on Judge Grant, who carefully closed the folder in front of him. He removed his glasses, placing them deliberately on the bench. For a moment it seemed as though time itself had paused. "Miss Halstead," he said slowly, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I would advise you to choose your words carefully from this point forward." The gravity of his tone caused even the most disinterested court spectators to sit up. But Tiffany, still oblivious to the seriousness of the situation, simply shrugged. "What? It's true," she said, leaning forward this time. "It's not like I hurt anyone. This whole thing is ridiculous." But what Tiffany failed to realize was that her words were no longer falling on deaf ears. Judge Grant's silence spoke volumes, and the courtroom was about to witness a response they would never forget. Judge Grant leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze fixed on Tiffany. The room remained silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Even Tiffany's lawyer, who had been shuffling papers nervously, stopped to glance at the judge. "You believe this is ridiculous, Miss Halstead?" Judge Grant asked, his tone steady, almost conversational. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in it was impossible to ignore. Tiffany scoffed. "Yeah, I do. I mean, come on, it's not like I robbed a bank or something. This is just overkill." She waved her hand dismissively, as though brushing away an imaginary nuisance. Judge Grant nodded slowly, folding his hands on the bench. "I see," he said. His calm demeanor only heightened the suspense, making the spectators edge closer to the edge of their seats. "Let me clarify something for you, Miss Halstead. The charges against you include not only reckless driving, but also endangering a pedestrian's life. The law does not measure accountability by the size of the crime, but by its impact. Do you understand that?" Tiffany rolled her eyes yet again, muttering under her breath, Sure, whatever you say." The whisper was soft, but it carried in the silence of the courtroom. The judge's face remained composed, but there was a shift, a slight narrowing of his eyes, a pause that signaled something was about to change. "Miss Halstead," Judge Grant began, his voice still calm. "Do you recall the incident from 2 weeks ago? The one that brought you here today?" Tiffany shrugged, looking bored. "Some guy stepped off the curb. I honked. He moved. End of story." The judge raised his eyebrows. "End of story, you say?" "Yeah," she said, crossing her arms. "No harm, no foul." But Judge Grant wasn't finished. He reached for a document on the bench, flipping through it with measured precision. Then he addressed the courtroom. "Let the record show," he said, his voice carrying authority, "that the pedestrian in question, Mr. Edward Lopez, was a 67-year-old retired teacher. He was crossing the street legally when Miss Halstead accelerated toward him, causing him to stumble and injure his wrist. He has since required medical attention and continues to experience pain." Tiffany's smirk faltered for the first time. She glanced at her lawyer, who whispered something to her, but she waved him off again. "I didn't hit him," she muttered. "He was fine." "Miss Halstead," Judge Grant continued, now directing his full attention back to her. "Does this sound like no harm, no foul to you?" But before Tiffany could open her mouth to reply, Judge Grant's next move would make it abundantly clear that her actions had far-reaching consequences. Consequences she could no longer ignore. Judge Grant's steady gaze remained fixed on Tiffany, his voice measured as he continued. "Miss Halstead, your perspective on this matter is troubling, not because of the charges themselves, but because of your refusal to acknowledge the weight of your actions." Tiffany leaned back in her chair, feigning nonchalance, though the growing tension in the room was impossible to miss. "Look, I said I didn't hit him. People are so dramatic these days." That comment elicited a few gasps from the courtroom gallery. Judge Grant tapped his pen lightly against the desk, pausing for a moment before speaking again. "Dramatic," he repeated, his tone still even. "Would you like to hear from Mr. Lopez himself, Miss Halstead? Because he's here today, in this courtroom." The air grew thick with anticipation. Tiffany's confident facade wavered, her eyes darting briefly toward the gallery. A man in the second row, Mr. Lopez, sat quietly, his arm in a sling. His weathered face showed no anger, only a kind of quiet disappointment that seemed to cut deeper than any harsh words could. Tiffany shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but her defiance wasn't entirely gone. "I'm sure he's fine," she muttered, though her voice lacked its earlier bravado. Judge Grant leaned forward slightly, his presence commanding the room. "Miss Halstead, your dismissal of this man's pain speaks volumes about your character. But this isn't just about him. It's about the precedent we set when individuals of privilege believe they are above accountability." The courtroom was so silent that even the faint scratch of the court reporter's pen could be heard. All eyes were on Judge Grant now, waiting to see what he would do next. Then, with a calm that belied the weight of his words, he said, "Since you seem unconcerned about the consequences of your actions, perhaps it's time you experience them firsthand." Tiffany blinked, her earlier bravado crumbling. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, a voice tinged with genuine worry for the first time. Judge Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the bailiff, who handed him a small stack of papers. The judge began reading aloud, detailing the fines, mandatory community service, and court-ordered sensitivity training Tiffany would need to complete. But it wasn't the penalties themselves that made the biggest impact. It was the way he delivered them, weaving in a powerful message about privilege, empathy, and the responsibility that comes with living in a shared society. But what truly shook Tiffany, and the entire courtroom, was the unexpected final decision Judge Grant announced, one that would make her confrontation with reality unavoidable. Judge Grant set the papers down, his gaze steady and unwavering. The weight of his next words seemed to fill the room before they were even spoken. "Miss Halstead," he began, "I have reviewed the details of this case extensively. Given the severity of your actions and your blatant disregard for accountability, I am issuing a sentence that I believe will not only address the legal violations, but also provide you with a much-needed perspective." Tiffany sat up straighter, her earlier flippancy replaced by a flicker of unease. "Perspective," she echoed, her voice edged with disbelief. "Yes," Judge Grant said firmly. "In addition to the fines and 200 hours of community service, you will spend the next 30 days volunteering at the downtown women's shelter. You will work directly with individuals who have faced hardship, often through no fault of their own. Perhaps then you'll understand the impact of carelessness and entitlement." A collective murmur spread through the room. This wasn't the typical sentence one expected in a case like this, and the crowd's mixed reactions were palpable. Some nodded in approval, others exchanged incredulous glances. But the most telling reaction came from Tiffany herself. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice rising. "You want me to what? Hang out with homeless people? That's not my problem." Judge Grant's face didn't change, but his voice grew colder. "Miss Halstead, it is precisely that mindset that landed you in this courtroom today. Your actions reflect a lack of understanding, a refusal to see how your choices affect those around you. This is not a punishment, it is an opportunity for growth. And let me be clear, failure to comply will result in a much harsher sentence." Tiffany's lawyer tugged at her sleeve, whispering urgently, but she yanked her arm away. "This is insane. You can't force me to do this." Judge Grant raised a hand, silencing her outburst. "Miss Halstead, this court has the authority to enforce community service as part of your sentence. You will report to the shelter by 8 a.m. each morning, and your supervisor will provide weekly progress updates. Should you fail to cooperate, I will see you back in this courtroom, under far less favorable circumstances." The room was silent again, the weight of Judge Grant's words hanging heavily in the air. Tiffany's face flushed with anger, but for once, she said nothing. She simply sat there, stunned and silent. But the moment wasn't over yet. Judge Grant's final remarks would leave a lasting impression, not just on Tiffany, but on everyone in the room. Judge Grant adjusted his glasses, his calm demeanor unshaken despite Tiffany's visible defiance. He let the silence stretch for a moment, ensuring his next words would land with full force. "Miss Halstead," he began, "this courtroom does not exist to humiliate or belittle. It exists to uphold justice and, when possible, to teach. Your privilege has shielded you from consequences for far too long, and that has cost you the ability to empathize. This is not about punishment. It's about helping you reclaim your humanity." The courtroom held its collective breath. Tiffany, clearly uncomfortable, glanced at the gallery, her bravado slipping further. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but seemed to think better of it. "Do you know what Mr. Lopez said when asked about his feelings towards you?" Judge Grant asked, his voice softer now, almost conversational. Tiffany shook her head, her eyes darting to Mr. Lopez, who remained seated in the gallery. His expression was still one of quiet disappointment. "He said," Judge Grant continued, "I don't want her to suffer. I just want her to understand, because if she doesn't, she'll keep hurting people and one day, it might be something she can't undo." The words landed like a hammer. Tiffany's face turned pale, her usual composure unraveling. For the first time, her defiance gave way to something else. Discomfort, perhaps even guilt. Judge Grant didn't let up. "Mr. Lopez, a man you nearly injured, has chosen grace over anger. He could have pressed for harsher penalties, but he asked for something different. An opportunity for you to learn. That's what this sentence represents." Tiffany shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her confidence eroded. The room was so quiet that every small sound, the shuffle of papers, the creak of a bench, seemed amplified. "You will report to the downtown women's shelter on Monday morning," Judge Grant continued. "There, you'll meet women who have faced challenges you cannot begin to imagine. Some have lost everything. Some are rebuilding their lives from the ground up. You will listen to their stories, and in doing so, I hope you begin to understand the value of humility and accountability." Tiffany looked as though she wanted to protest, but the weight of the moment seemed to hold her tongue. Her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, signaling for her to stay quiet. But even as the judge's words began to sink in, the real transformation would only begin once Tiffany faced the realities waiting for her outside the sheltered bubble of her privilege. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the hearing. "This court is adjourned," Judge Grant announced, his voice firm. As he rose from his seat and exited the courtroom, the tension in the room seemed to linger, like a storm that had just passed but left its mark. Tiffany remained seated, her face a mixture of disbelief and indignation. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering hurriedly, but she barely acknowledged him. The gallery began to empty, the murmurs of the onlookers rising as people discussed what they had just witnessed. Mr. Lopez stood slowly, his slinged arm a stark reminder of the incident that had brought them all here. He glanced at Tiffany as he passed, his expression still kind but resolute. She avoided his gaze, staring instead at the table in front of her. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already gathered, eager to capture the fallout from the dramatic hearing. Tiffany's name, already a headline for her socialite antics, was now linked to a moment of courtroom drama that had captivated everyone in attendance. Cameras flashed as she emerged, flanked by her lawyer, who shielded her from the barrage of questions. "Ms. Halstead, do you have any comment on today's sentencing?" one reporter called out. "Do you feel the sentence was fair? What are your thoughts on Judge Grant's decision?" Tiffany's usual arrogance resurfaced for a moment. "No comment," she snapped, pushing past the crowd and into the waiting car. But inside, the facade began to crack. As the doors closed and the noise of the reporters faded, her shoulders slumped. For the first time, it seemed, reality was setting in. That evening, the story was the top headline across news outlets. Clips from the courtroom, including Judge Grant's powerful words, went viral, sparking widespread discussion. Social media lit up with opinions, some praising the judge's decision, others criticizing Tiffany's behavior. But the most poignant commentary came from Mr. Lopez, who gave a brief statement outside the courthouse. "I don't want her to fail," he said. "I just hope she learns, because when we stop learning, we stop growing, and that's when we truly lose." The simplicity of his words struck a chord, resonating far beyond the courtroom. For Tiffany, though, the lesson was only beginning. Monday loomed ahead, and with it, a world far removed from her designer handbags and privileged lifestyle. But what Tiffany would soon discover was that real change doesn't come from being told. It comes from seeing, from doing, and from feeling the weight of someone else's reality. Monday arrived with an unfamiliar chill for Tiffany, both in the air and in her chest. She stood outside the downtown women's shelter, her oversized sunglasses hiding the hesitation in her eyes. The building was modest, bustling with activity as volunteers and staff hurried about. For the first time in a long while, Tiffany felt out of place. As she stepped inside, the warm hum of voices and the clatter of kitchen utensils greeted her. A staff member, a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached her. "You must be Tiffany," she said, her tone friendly but firm. "Welcome. Let's get you started." The hours passed slowly at first. Tiffany was assigned to help prepare meals, serve food, and clean up afterward. She didn't speak much, keeping her head down, her usual bravado stripped away. But as the day wore on, she began to notice things she hadn't before. The gratitude in the smiles of the shelter's guests, the camaraderie among the staff, and the resilience in the stories she overheard. One woman, a single mother of 3, shared her struggles with Tiffany over lunch. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of years of hardship. "You think you've got it all figured out," she said, her eyes meeting Tiffany's. "But life has a way of teaching you what really matters." That night, as Tiffany drove home, her thoughts were uncharacteristically quiet. The faces of the people she'd met lingered in her mind, along with Judge Grant's words. For the first time, she began to wonder if there was more to life than the world she had built for herself. A world of privilege, isolation, and superficiality. In the weeks that followed, Tiffany's mandatory service continued. Day by day, the walls she had built around herself began to crack. She listened more, spoke less, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to change. By the time her sentence was complete, Tiffany stood before Judge Grant once more, this time a quieter, more introspective version of herself. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, "for not giving up on me." Judge Grant nodded, his face softening just slightly. "The real thanks will come when you take what you've learned and use it to make a difference." As Tiffany left the courthouse, the sun shining brightly overhead, she carried a small but powerful hope, a chance to rebuild, not just her life, but her perspective. And so, Tiffany's journey became a reminder to everyone that change is possible, but it takes humility, courage, and the willingness to confront one's flaws. What will you do today to open your heart and mind to the lessons life has to teach? If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that inspire reflection and growth.